Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. When we asked the Germans in last year's survey whether they support the idea of a common European army, last year 58% were in favor. 1 year later, we have this debate back on the agenda with different options. Shall we have an army of Europeans or a European army? What may sound to outsiders perhaps like only a linguistic difference is actually, in fact, represents a major policy debate within the European Union on the future of security and defense integration. It is a great honor for us to welcome Defense Minister von der Leyen back to Körber Foundation to discuss this topic in a spotlight interview with Britta Sandberg in cooperation with Der Spiegel. The interview will be conducted in German, so please, everyone who does not understand German, take your devices now. Can Europe defend itself? That is the question of our discussion. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Frau Ministerin.
Minister, you're the first lady in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany in the Defense Ministry. And thus, you've got a ministry that is regarded as the ejection seat. I don't think any of the predecessors actually suffered more than 2 legislative periods. There's many things that might explode, and at the moment there's a consultant's affair at the moment. Did you ever rue accepting this position? No, never. So, and the question of First Lady, I'm not the first time that in such a situation. So I remember when in 2009 I became the Minister of Labour Affairs. It was the first time that a woman was the Minister for Labour Affairs the first time. And I had a similar situation as with the Defence Ministry, because then, I mean, that's quite some years ago, that there was, when you look at the board chairmen of the employers and the trade unions, there was a whole rank of men and no women. So I was used to that situation, and at the ministry and also the Federal Army, there was curiosity, and first of all, that so I noticed it very much at the beginning, so for me too, on both sides, and afterwards, I think for most, it was interesting that I had a new view, a new perspective for this subject from the situation as a Minister of Labour Affairs, because I knew exactly what it meant. So with young people, also to have enough feedback that you could actually recruit them and have experts in the long run, but also subjects that have been around in the Federal Army for a long time, and that was a whole range of subjects, be it the balance, work-life balance, or also setting up a cyber troop. We've got 15,000 men and women in the cyber troop. When I came, there was no one in that area. So I think there was quite a lot of curiosity, and sometimes also, some were suspicious. So what does she want, and what is the new developments in store? So now everyone's cooperating well, and because there's so many different subjects on the agenda, so the trend changes in the Federal Army, and the Federal Army is growing, and the security policy subjects, and I suppose we're going to, you discussed many of them already. So this is a broad range, and honestly, it doesn't really play a role whether you're man or woman. At the moment, in the past 2 years, I noticed continuity. So modernization and growth costs, keeping the costs, and so that is important. So you gotten used to the many men, and the men gotten used to you. And we've got more and more women in the ministry as well as the troops. And that's something I look out for. Yesterday, there was unsettling news in the Strait of Kerch. There was a shooting of a Ukrainian military boat, and yesterday afternoon, Poroshenko, the president, then imposed martial law. So how long and unsettling do you think is the situation for you? Well, indeed, it is a situation that, once again, we're very concerned about. And behind that, I think when you take a step back, there's the basic principle, and that's what it's all about at the end of the day. That time and again, we have to look out for it and try to achieve that the joint and common international regulations which you set up from the bitter experience of the past century that everyone adheres to these rules and so that's a discussion we have with the Russian all the time. So to start with the annexation of Crimea and the break of international law, then the violation of international law, and also the inviolability of Ukrainian territory was not respected any longer. So when you look at this today, so the Strait of Kerch, so since 2003, there's been a treaty between Ukraine and Russia. It's a free passage, guaranteeing the free passage. So in other words, in this heated situation, it's very important indeed that we stay level-headed and we say there's a rule. Everyone needs to stick to it. Sometimes we don't like them either, but that's what the rules are all about, that they create consensus. And these rules also include that so once you've agreed the mechanism to give the passage of the vessels and also to release the ships and the crews, and Ukraine also needs to adhere to this, and also the demand to Russia to stick to the agreed rules. And I think it's good that the world community, in their reactions, as you can see, that pretty agreed and coming back to the agreed rules. So you haven't said how dangerous you think it is. Well, that depends, doesn't it? So there is a situation we're concerned about, and it depends very much on all people are moderate, and they also influence both sides moderately, and to see how they can work for de-escalation. So the demand needs to go to Russia and Ukraine. What are your steps for de-escalation in this tense situation to contribute to de-escalation? So the threat for Europe, but we heard that, I discussed that this morning, has become different. There's new sources of unrest, there's new challenges in cyber defense, so there's new challenges in terror fighting, and at the Munich Security Conference in 2014, you said yourself, there's no option to lean back, and Germany would have to take over more responsibility. The French President Macron just recently introduced the suggestion of a European army, and the Chancellor said it's actually quite a good idea, and he also reaffirmed this in the essay you wrote for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung. So now, if we take that seriously, the term European army, so you can only assume this is a uniform army under a uniform European commander with the headquarters in Brussels, and this would mean passing on sovereign rights. Is that a realistic option at all? And if yes, and over what period of time? So 2025, 2030, 2040. So what you quite rightly sketched out as the French president and the chancellor call it is the vision. So it's a long-term vision. And I will come back to today in a minute. I will come back to today's situation. So I want to say up front that, and that's always important to say, so why has so little grown in the field in Europe? So when I came to the defense ministry, I had experience as family minister, as a minister for labor affairs in Europe, so I knew what was growing in Europe. And I was surprised at how little to nothing actually was there in comparison to what you did with a single European market, also the common labor policies. So this explains easily, but thank goodness we've got NATO. Next year is 70 years under the umbrella and protection of NATO. Europe also developed. You mustn't forget that. And NATO is and will remain the absolute cornerstone, the pillar of national and alliance defense for us, and there is no question about that. That is set in stone. However, there are subjects and areas and crises which you discussed this morning already that have something to do with Europe, not with NATO. Europe, Africa, for instance, typical subject. How do we handle our neighboring continent? So Europe needs to be ready to act, and that is, with regard to defense policy, it hasn't been able to act for a long time. So Mali 2013 is a classic example that we were unable to act. So the country just disintegrated before our eyes, and we knew that, and we were aware. If it wasn't to become a second Libya, we needed to intervene. Europe would like to do that, but it was totally unable to do so because there was no possibilities. It took months. And then the French come in and prevented the worst from happening. Today, we're there as Europeans, but it took us months. Now, from this experience, so yeah, we are NATO, and there's certain subjects in NATO, and there's other subjects for us Europeans where we have to act independent and we have to take over responsibility. And last year, there was a part from the Lisbon Treaty that had slept there for 10 years. That is the European Defence Union, and there's detailed terms like PESCO, etc. But the connection of 25 countries in Europe, ambitious and binding in a rule book together with joint projects. We've got the European Defence Fund. That's very important because it creates incentives to invest together and also to develop our forces together.
Europäische Armee.
So,
Frage nach der
well, you asked about the sovereignty. Today, I deliberately talk about the development, the establishment of an army of the armed forces of the Europeans. As you said in the introduction, it may seem just a semantic play of words, but it isn't. It's a question of who, after all, takes decisions. And we are currently integrating our armed forces. So step by step, we see an army of the Europeans developing. Let's take the Netherlands as an example. They gave us part of their tanks. We gave them part of our Marines. And 70 years ago, we were enemies, and today our troops are integrated. We have the German-French brigade, which is in Mali at the moment, fulfilling a European mission. And this growing together of the armed forces as an army of the Europeans, where the national parliaments still have responsibility, but still we are very much dovetailed. This is the way to go forward to one day reach our vision and fulfill our vision to have a European army. So what you think is an integration, a continuation of integration of national armed forces. This is what you think is the right way to go forward, so we can put the troops together depending on the mission at hand. This is how an army of the Europeans can grow. And don't forget, until a year ago, there was no structure whatsoever. Now we plan together, we invest together. It's no longer 27 European countries that are very fragmented and develop their armed forces in their own way. The airplane of the next generation, the ground forces of the next generation, all of that is developed by us together as Europeans in an independent way in order to develop our capabilities. We have set up our rule book where we also identify the gaps that we have. This is PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. So one day, if there will be a crisis, European will be and should be in a position to say, this is where our headquarters are, this is where our army is, these are the political fast-track decision mechanisms. So if Europe wants to act, we can act. We can bring in all the different armed forces, air force and ground troops and all of that. We can deploy that together. It sounds all simple, but it is a huge logistical work that we have tackled now in order to be fully operational one day. There is a problem that you outlined regarding Mali. Some crises demand a fast response. As long as the German parliament must approve such a mission, this makes it impossible to react quickly. I don't think so. First of all, the reservation of approval to be given by Parliament, that's the literal translation of the German term that we have. It sounds a bit negative, but I mean, without Parliament, look at the UK and look at the United States. We cannot act without Parliament, and it's absolutely okay to have it that way. Don't forget, we are sending our soldiers to very dangerous missions. That means they have and we have a very high responsibility. We always must give a comprehensive explanation to our people, and this is only possible when we work together with parliamentarians. What we can improve is the speed of decision making processes, not just wait until Europe finally takes a decision, then go to the government, then go to parliament, then months will go by without anything being decided. I came up with a proposal. I said, why don't we take our security experts from parliament and why don't we integrate them into a decision-making mechanism as early as possible in an emerging crisis so that we are capable of acting quickly whenever there is a need, so that we can take the final decision, get the approval of Parliament within a couple of days in order to be able to respond as Europeans. What I'm saying is the approval of Parliament, that's something we need to keep. It's very precious to have it. But in a crisis, we can make our decisions in a much faster way. So you call it the Sherpa principle. That is to say, people, experts would be informed about a crisis, about possible solutions in order to speed up decisions. How do you do that politically? There will always be some people who block decisions in Parliament. Now look at the realities of our comprehensive topics, highly complex topics. In the parliamentary groups, people trust the expertise of our specialists, like for instance digitization, agriculture, the environment, labor, tax. No parliamentarian can know it all, and that is why we have the principle of using experts in the parliamentary groups who have the in-depth knowledge and make it possible for the parliamentary group to take decisions quickly. The experts would outline the risks and opportunities, give recommendations. That's a constant process that goes on in politics all the time. We know it. And we want this expertise be closer to the European decision-making mechanism so we can respond more swiftly. Wolfgang Ischinger, the president of the Munich Security Conference, proposed recently that instead of the approval of Parliament, one might think of another mechanism, the opposite mechanism, namely the veto of parliamentarians, where you would have a clearly defined framework for military missions abroad, and only when there is a parliament veto, such a process would be stopped. Could you identify with such an idea? And since Parliament's approval, of course, means that basically people must agree, well, such a proposal coming from Wolfgang Ischinger, well, I think we should develop trust and confidence in Parliament as early as possible in order to respond more swiftly. As I said before, international developments are totally different. Governments do not take decision in isolation anymore. Parliaments get more and more involved. The Brits, the Americans, who used to be the ones where the head of government said, let's go ahead. Now the Parliament says, no, stop it. We want to be involved as well. And that is correct, because that's democracy. I still believe that this broad-based approval and decision-making is the right way. And we just need to make our processes more efficient instead of, taking decision without the involvement of Parliament, saying that given certain conditions we will act. I think we need to make sure we have the right solutions for the specific crisis. All the crises were different. Take the case of Mali and IS, Iraq, Afghanistan, our mission in the Mediterranean. They are all different, these missions. The NATO missions that we have between Greece and Turkey, just a few of these missions were mentioned by me. Behind each of these missions, there's a totally different scenario. So it's difficult to come up with a general decision saying, given that and that condition in place, we will do this and that. I think it is much better to develop expertise as soon as possible, develop trust and confidence, and then speed up processes. Let's take the French and the German and their military cooperation. The Germans have classically and traditionally the culture of restraint. They try to include as many people as possible in cooperation. The French are less afraid of acting quickly in a military sense, and they can even decide on having a mission in Africa with non-EU partners like the UK. How do you organize that cooperation with a different country? Well, that's the secret of the functioning of Europe. Over all these years, not just when I was Minister of Defense, but also when I was Minister of Labour at a time where unemployment was very high and we had to develop many solutions for that problem. We are very different, the French and the Germans. Well, basically Europeans, all Europeans are very diverse, are very different. And that is why it is a very wise European principle to work closely with the French. I see my French colleagues very regularly, and time and again we talk about the spectrum that is between our ways of thinking and find a common way to go forward. As you said, we as Germans are usually quite reluctant to take action, and the French are much more proactive. So they're both cultures that have to change a little, and bringing them together, making sure that showing restraint does not mean refusing responsibility. That is one thing. But on the other hand, we should also slow the French a little bit down before they take action without having sort of all the aspects. Bringing all of that together, finding the right balance, means we have to work on a constant basis, on a permanent basis, and take decisions together. We have the German-French Brigade in Mali. Of course, before the mission starts, we are together. Then, of course, we take our common decisions regarding further steps to be taken. So it's always a negotiation process, but it is the right way. And it's also the basic essence of democracy, finding a common way, not saying you're dominating everything or I and my decisions will dominate everything. It always means finding a common solution. All of that is happening, has been happening for a couple of years already. In the essay that I quoted in the beginning, you have said we now have to walk the talk. What does that mean in terms of a timeline? As you said in the beginning, the European army is something you consider unrealistic. When do you think we could have a tangible change where for the first time we see the army of the Europeans intervening in a crisis? Walking the talk. I think that's the right vision that was mentioned both by our Chancellor and the French President. We have to now follow the strategy they have developed. PESCO is an enormous step forward. We earmark 13 billion euros for the European Defence Fund. For the first time, European money will go into common procurement. We have a common planning process that's also an action. And in a couple of weeks, we are going to define how third parties can be integrated in projects. What about the UK? How can they participate? What about Norway, a non-EU member? How can they get involved? Together with the French side, we are developing at the moment the airplane of the next generation that is going to be Europeanized. The same can be said for the tank. The next generation of tanks will be European. So I mentioned one of the, or a couple of the daily activities that we carry out together. We're also using the German-French Brigade, but we also have the German-Dutch Corps. It will be the next rapid response spearhead of NATO. So it's a very close cooperation between Germany and the Netherlands. Our goal is, you never know when the next crisis and where the next crisis is going to come. At that moment, we'd like to be in a position as Europeans to decide together, to act together. Do you think you will have a rapid response force, an intervention force? Yes. We shouldn't forget that we as Europeans are doing a lot already. Ever since the beginning of this millennium or century, we have carried out about 35 civilian and military missions as Europeans. So it doesn't mean we have to start from scratch now. There are two important aspects. We will have to form what I call a European headquarter, because Europe is unique. It's not just focused on the military dimension. We talk about the military dimension as well, but it's always embedded in diplomacy, development cooperation, civilian and police cooperation, legal cooperation, and the commitment that goes with such forms of cooperation. So that is a very unique feature of Europe, and I think that's something very special, very precious, and we need to strengthen this as much as possible. So we need to develop this kind of common European headquarter in order to use all the instruments efficiently, because at a moment of crisis, Europe can only calm things down when first diplomats will act, then politicians, the police, the lawyers, the teachers, all of them will have to carry out their work in a sustainable and stabilizing manner. That is Europe, and that's a totally different approach compared to many others in the world. And I'd like to cultivate that. I'd like to develop it further. All the things that have happened now recently, has that something to do with the changing situation in the United States? Well, the change in the US was not the main trigger, because the demand of the US that Europe better organize themselves and shoulder their own responsibility, that demand is much older than the current administration. I remember how President Obama said it. He said it in a more polite way, but he still said it. And it's very important for us to take care of our own affairs and be in a position to do something. That's not just a question of the demands of Canadians or Americans. It's a question of self-identification. And then secondly, Europe has become much bigger ever since German reunification, and that is why the political weight of Europe has increased as well. That's good to see when we look at the nice things in the world, but it's also an obligation when you look at the not so nice things in the world. So I hope and I wish that this Europe will get organized like we do in defense policy at the moment, and the same should be done in Europe, also in the field of foreign policy. Again, we need fast decisions, and Europe should speak in one voice. We still have the unanimity principle. So when we have 27 member countries, if one single country says no, it will stop all the others. So Europe will be silent in such a situation in a moment of crisis. And so I think the majority principle must be introduced also in the field of foreign policy, so that a broad majority can act swiftly and Europe will become visible and audible.
So I think this is the right approach for us Europeans. Finally, I want to move away from security policy a little bit and talk about your party. So at the beginning of December, you're going to have a discussion about a new party leader. So you have followed this approach of modernization of CDU for 13 years. Now, at the 17th of December, the decision will be taken whether this path will be continued, maybe with a woman in the leadership, or the more conservative wing will win the day. Have you got any clue of what's going to happen? I ask a lot of people around in my acquaintances, and nobody knows it. I suppose no one in this hall has got a sure feeling of where the balance is going to tip to. So I think it's an extremely exciting time, because we've got a whole range of different possibilities of answering current affairs. I mean, you know that there's a lot of discussion going on, and so these events are very well visited. They need to rent large halls, and there's 2 or 3 hours and nobody leaves the hall. And just because there's such a lot of interest, and the discussion is great. And so we could live stream. I think the first 4 was there was 150,000 visit us by a live stream. So in other words, there is a need for discussion. So why is that the case? So it really is the case that all these questions we have ahead of us, so the next 10 to 15 years are now sketched out. What do the candidates think? So what do you think about this? What is your opinion about this? How do you want to solve this problem? So it's a very exciting time. So we've still got 2 weeks to go ahead of us. And we're going to use it as I knows. And I can't say what's going to happen in the party conference. I mean, 2 weeks is a long time. Also, you have to say that you get to know that these candidates more and more in the different areas, and it's a good thing. Have you got a preference? Yes, I do have a preference. I will always be asked this, but I'm consistent like all the others up to the party conference. I'm going to, I mean, there's every day new things pop up, and I'll see what happens, and then I'll take my decision. So as you're not going to talk about your preference, my last question is, do women do politics differently than... So one of my colleagues asked this of various female politicians. The answers were astonishingly consistent. They said, well, there's more relaxation, less excitement, status symbols are not so important. And you answered it yourself, women in top positions are so rare, they don't need a big clock, or watch rather, to stand out. Did I really say that? So everyone's looking at their watch now, right? And women, so I mean, be it politics or management, so it's always important that it does not mean better, but it means differently. And so that's the exciting thing, isn't it? So with mixed teams, they've got different views of the risks and the opportunities. And yeah, it is right. And so I've, for many, many years, I've had, I experienced many high-ranking leading bot days, and the type of resolving conflicts is different from women. So we don't shout, and we don't have this position. This is typical what the men do. And so dominance, no, as a woman, you have to learn to use other patterns. And so I am not so much in politics, but I work a lot of in medicine. I was a junior doctor. I was people shouted at me a lot, so they tried to actually compensate the weakness of the arguments by volume. So, and you can only say, well, you're going to send them the bill of the ENT doctor, then usually they cut down the volume. You have to learn to handle this. I did that over the years, but I have to say also that these are just patterns, and women. So as a family minister, I was in bot days where there was many, many women. Again, there's patterns there too. So it's not like it's only in a very male-dominated world that you have got the patterns, but you've got them in the amongst women as well. And the duration, over time, what will win the day is, which both think is pleasant. So calm, balanced, fact-oriented approach, that will win the day. Not always in the short term. Sometimes the more dominant and loud person will win the day, but in the long run, that the more relaxed element is the better one. When you say basta, I suppose you say it in a very quiet voice. Indeed. Minister, it was very good that you were here. Thank you very much for your time, for your explanations, and your views. Well, thank you.